There's a moment, right before everything falls apart, where you can almost see it coming. Almost. And yet somehow, even when you know the ending, even when you've read the history books and you know exactly what happens, it still doesn't feel real. That's what Anne Boleyn does to you. She gets under your skin. Because this wasn't just a woman who married a king. This was a woman who rewrote the rules of an entire kingdom, who reshaped a religion, who looked the most powerful man in England in the eyes and said, "Not yet." And somehow, impossibly, it worked. Until it didn't. Today we're going to walk through something that I genuinely believe is one of the most haunting stories in all of human history. Not just English history, human history, because what happened to Anne Boleyn wasn't just a royal scandal. It was a warning, a masterclass in how quickly power can turn, how a throne can become a trap, how the same man who moves heaven and earth to have you can decide almost overnight that you need to disappear. We're going to talk about who she really was before the crown, how she rose, how she fell, and then we're going to ask the question that historians have been quietly arguing about for nearly 500 years. Was any of it even true? Before we get into it, if you're new here, welcome to the Forbidden Archive. This is a place where history gets told the way it actually deserves to be told. Hit that like button, subscribe, and click the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. We go deep here, always. Now, let's go back. Anne Boleyn was born into a world that had very specific ideas about what a woman was supposed to be. Quiet, obedient, useful, married off strategically, kept in the background, and forgotten about as quickly as possible. That was the script. That was the expectation. And never read that script. She grew up in a family that was ambitious, yes, but she wasn't supposed to be the one who mattered. Her sister Mary was already at court, already catching the king's eye, and was the younger one, sent off to Europe to be educated. First in the Netherlands, then in France in the court of Queen Claude. And something happened to her over there that you don't really find in most textbooks. She became herself. France in the early 1500s was a different world from England. The women there were educated, opinionated, politically aware. They read, they debated, they held their own in conversations that would have gotten them laughed out of an English room, and absorbed all of it. The language, the culture, the confidence. She came back to England a completely different person than the one who had left. And the English court didn't quite know what to do with her. She was witty in a way that made people uncomfortable. She dressed differently. She carried herself differently. Some people found her magnetic. Others found her threatening. Often it was the same people. There's something about a woman who doesn't shrink herself that makes certain people deeply uneasy. Especially in a world built on the assumption that she should. And walked into the English court and she didn't apologize for any of it. Not her opinions, not her sharpness, not the way she could hold a conversation with a scholar, a bishop, or a king and leave all three of them thinking about her long after she'd left the room. She had this quality that's genuinely hard to describe. It wasn't just beauty. Plenty of women at court were beautiful. It was something else, a kind of presence. Like she was always thinking 2 steps ahead and she wanted you to know it. Henry noticed her. Of course he did. But here's what most people get wrong about that moment. They imagine it as this grand romantic story. King sees woman, falls in love, changes the world. And yes, on the surface, that's what happened. But the reality underneath it is far more complicated and honestly far more interesting. Henry VIII in the mid-1520s was not the bloated, paranoid tyrant we picture from his later portraits. He was in his 30s. He was athletic, charismatic, educated. He considered himself a Renaissance man. He wrote poetry. He played music. He genuinely believed he was one of the great kings of his era. And his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, which had once been a political triumph, had quietly become something that was eating at him. Catherine had not given him a surviving son. In that world, in that time, that wasn't just a personal disappointment. It was almost an existential crisis. A king without a male heir was a dynasty waiting to collapse. Henry had watched his own family claw its way through a brutal civil war to sit on that throne. The idea of dying without a son to inherit it kept him up at night. He was convinced God was punishing him. He had built an entire theological argument in his own head about why his marriage to Catherine was illegitimate in the eyes of heaven. And walked in, and she wouldn't give him what he wanted. That part is so important, and it almost never gets the attention it deserves. Anne Boleyn did not fall into Henry's arms. She stepped back. She told him, in language careful enough to be deniable and clear enough to be understood, that she was not interested in being his mistress. Her sister had been there. She had watched what happened to women who gave a king everything he wanted. They were used and discarded and forgotten, and wanted something real.
Something de permanent.
Something that couldn't be taken away in the morning. She wanted the ring. And Henry, for the first time in a very long time, was told no. By a woman who wasn't a queen. Who had no armies, no political leverage, no real power in any traditional sense. Just her mind, her restraint, and the absolutely devastating understanding that the moment she gave in, she lost everything. So she didn't give in. And Henry became consumed. Consumed is almost too small a word for what Henry became. He wrote her letters. 17 of them survive to this day, kept in the Vatican archives of all places, which is its own kind of irony when you think about what those letters eventually cost the Catholic Church in England. They're extraordinary documents, not because they're written by a king, but because of how human they sound, how desperate. There's one where he talks about wishing he were in his sweetheart's arms. There's another where he says the time since her last letter has seemed very long to him. This is a man who commanded nations, writing like a lovesick boy who can't sleep. And then wrote back carefully, always carefully. She kept him wanting, kept him hoping, not out of cruelty, I don't think, but out of survival. Because and understood something that Henry, in his obsession, had temporarily forgotten. Power is only power when the other person still wants something from you. The moment she surrendered that, she had nothing. So while Henry burned and waited, and while she waited, she started to build. Because here's the thing about Anne Boleyn that gets lost in the romance of the story. She wasn't just playing hard to get. She was genuinely intelligent, genuinely politically aware, and she had real convictions. She was drawn to the new religious ideas coming out of Europe. The reformist thinking. The idea that ordinary people should have access to scripture in their own language. That the church had drifted too far from something true. These weren't just abstract ideas to her. She actually believed them. She carried a copy of William Tyndale's English New Testament, which at the time was essentially contraband. She read it, discussed it, encouraged others to read it. In a court where religion was politics and politics was survival, that was not a small thing. And Henry, who had ironically written a famous defense of the Catholic Church just years earlier, was listening. Because when you're in love with someone, you start to see the world through their eyes a little. You start to find merit in the things they find merit in. And Anne's religious views gave Henry something incredibly useful, a theological framework for what he already desperately wanted to do anyway. If the Pope's authority wasn't absolute, if the Church of England could answer to the crown instead of Rome, then maybe Henry didn't need the Pope's permission to end his marriage at all. Maybe he never had. The wheels began to turn. What followed was years, not months, years, of political maneuvering, of back and forth with Rome, of Cardinal Wolsey trying and failing to deliver the annulment Henry wanted and paying for that failure with everything he had. Of Anne's enemies at court watching and waiting for her to make a mistake. Of Catherine of Aragon refusing with quiet, immovable dignity to simply disappear. Of a king growing more impatient, more erratic, more convinced that God and history were both on his side. Through all of it and held on. And in 1533, after nearly 7 years of waiting, she finally became queen. 7 years. Think about that for a moment. In a world where women had almost no agency, no political standing, no real protection outside of a man's goodwill. She held a king at arm's length for 7 years and came out the other side wearing a crown. That's not luck. That's not just charm. That's extraordinary. But crowns are heavy things. And the moment Anne finally had hers, something shifted. The game she had been playing, the careful distance, the calculated restraint, none of that worked anymore. Because now she was queen. And being queen meant something very specific in Henry's world. It meant producing a son. She gave birth in September 1533. The whole court was waiting. Henry was waiting. The astrologers had predicted a boy. The nursery was ready. The announcement was drafted with a blank space where they fully expected to write the word prince. It was a girl, Elizabeth. Henry was disappointed. He tried not to show it too obviously, but the court noticed. And though Henry still loved her then, still believed she would give him the son he needed, something had quietly cracked. Not broken, not yet, but cracked. The miscarriages came after that. One, then another. Then in January 1536, a pregnancy that ended in what some historians believe was a stillborn boy. That one devastated everything. Henry had just suffered a jousting injury that left him unconscious for 2 hours, and some historians believe it changed him neurologically, made him more volatile, more paranoid, more sudden in his decisions. Whether that's true or not, what's certain is that after that last lost pregnancy, Henry was done waiting. He had already noticed Jane Seymour, and the people around Henry, the ones who had always resented Anne, who had watched her rise with barely concealed fury, they noticed him noticing. And they moved. What happened next was swift in a way that should make your stomach turn. In April 1536, Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, began building a case. The charges that emerged were almost theatrical in how extreme they were. Adultery with 5 men, including her own brother George. Plotting to kill the king. Witchcraft was whispered though never formally charged. The accusations were so serious, so numerous, so deliberately overwhelming that the sheer weight of them was supposed to make questioning them feel almost disrespectful. But when you actually look at the evidence, when you sit with it the way serious historians have for centuries, there's almost nothing there. The timelines don't hold up. Several of the alleged encounters happened on dates when Anne was documented to be somewhere else entirely. The confessions that were extracted, and they were extracted, came from men who were tortured or threatened or both. One of the accused, a musician named Mark Smeaton, was the only one who confessed, and his confession was almost certainly beaten out of him. The others denied everything until the end. And herself, at her trial, was composed in a way that people in that room never forgot. She answered the charges clearly. She denied everything. She didn't beg. She didn't collapse. She stood in front of a panel of judges who had already decided the verdict before she opened her mouth, and she conducted herself with a dignity that reportedly left several observers shaken. She was found guilty, unanimously, took 15 minutes. On the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn walked out onto the Tower Green. She had asked for a skilled swordsman rather than an axe, a request that was granted, which in the grim arithmetic of Tudor executions was considered a mercy. She spoke briefly to the crowd. She didn't condemn Henry. She thanked him, actually, for the honors he had shown her. Whether that was genuine or strategic or simply the only safe thing left to say, nobody really knows. Then she knelt down, and that was it. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour. 11 days. So here's the question that never really goes away. Was she guilty? The honest answer, the one that evidence points to, is almost certainly no. Most serious historians today believe the charges were fabricated. That Cromwell constructed the case not because there was truth in it, but because Henry needed a way out and needed to be destroyed rather than simply discarded. But here's what stays with me long after the facts. She never stopped being herself. Not once. Not when the walls closed in. Not at the trial. Not on that morning in May. She was sharp and composed and unbowed in a world that had been trying to diminish her since the beginning. She came from nothing remarkable. She had no armies, no birthright that entitled her to power. She had her mind, her nerve, and an absolute refusal to be what everyone expected her to be. And she changed England forever. The church Henry built to marry her, however imperfect, however tangled in his own selfishness, it reshaped a nation. And the daughter they called a disappointment on the day she was born grew up to become Elizabeth I, Gloriana, one of the most powerful monarchs in the history of the world. And Boleyn didn't get the ending she deserved, but the story she left behind, that outlasted everything.